I'd like to call to order this annual meeting of the Justice and Grace Vineyard Incorporated Board of Officers. We have a quorum present. Let us deal with the first item of agenda. We have a stockholders report. He's reporting on Section 2, Paragraph C, entitled Labor Policy. Since you don't have the docket in front of you, let me read it to you. Fortunately, during the harvest, we can find an unlimited pool of available laborers down in the town square. We take the buses down at daybreak in order to find the best people, and we contract for as many as we will think we will need that day. If work exceeds beyond our projections, we can always go back at 9 o'clock in the morning. We can go back at noon. We can even go back at 3 o'clock if we need to. Or even at the height of the crisis last year, we hired folks at 5 p.m. They worked the final 2 hours until sundown. We paid them the same amount as the folks who had worked for the entire day. Oh, an interruption for point of order? No, I didn't say we paid them on the same scale as those who worked the entire day. We paid them the same amount as the entire day. Why did we do that? Well, the owner of the company told us to. Oh, a motion to censure the president of the company? A motion to hire an accounting firm to come in and help us with best business practices, that's just completely illogical to pay that way? So ordered, meeting adjourned. Maybe some of you missed that meeting. You were across town at the local 44 Union of Vineyard Workers. That meeting went something like this. A young man with brown, burnished hair and intense speech, dramatic gestures, describes his experience of working all day long at the Justice and Grace Vineyards. And just before quitting time, the foreman brought in an additional bus full of laborers to help clean up. They worked a couple of hours maximum in the cool of the evening. And when we lined up to get our checks, they got these big checks, and we didn't get a penny more. An audible gasp fills the hall, sweeps through the crowd, and then shouts from every corner. When order is finally restored, the vote is taken. A one-week boycott for all products from the Justice and Grace Vineyard. And during that week, we will have picket lines in front of the company. We'll teach those folks how to mess with organized labor. Given the tactics of the vineyard owner, let's face it, corporate America, the board of directors, isn't out of line with a censure and a reorganization strategy. The union workers are not aligned with their response, which makes it all the more painful to recognize Jesus is using this to tell us what kingdom living actually looks like. You saw it on the faces of the kids. You see it in the expressions of your own heart. When we start talking about money, we are real quick to say life is not fair. Dave came up and talked to us about the critical care campaign and how we have needs within the congregation. But one of the things that we haven't talked about is, what if I were to tell you that a benefactor came to me and said, Russ, I want you to make a point in today's sermon. I want you to help folks really understand what it means to have money that you didn't expect. And so here's what the benefactor says to me. You've got $10,000 with one stipulation. Half of it goes to the charity of their choice, and the other half is for that person to spend however they like. Now, I was anxious about this offering to you all for several reasons. The first of all, of course, being, what if Carolyn and I win it? Then somebody's going to think, oh, well, it's rigged, and I'm the one that rigged it. But if you will look on the back of your bulletin, if you have the line that says, God's grace is sufficient, printed in red ink, then you're the winner of that $10,000. How'd you feel turning the back of the page? Hopeful, right? We all like the idea of money we can't get. If you listened carefully to the beginning of the story, I said, what if I were to tell you that someone were to do that? Today's passage gets us mad. It's not fair that the guy who comes in last, cleans up for 20 minutes or an hour or 2 hours, gets the same pay as what I got if I started at the first break of dawn that morning. Let me offer you the illustration another way. Yesterday, I got up at 5 o'clock in the morning. 5 a.m. on my day off, so that I could be ready to leave the house, tools gathered, wife ready, truck loaded by 6 a.m. So I could pick up my passengers, I could pick up a little breakfast, I could be here at the church to pick up the rest of my passengers, and we could be on the road by 6:30 in the morning to get to Thornwell for a day of service. Seems like I get pretty high marks for being the early laborer of the day, doesn't it? Until I think about Michael and the youth. What time did you guys gather to leave yesterday? Oh, that's right, you didn't. You went the day before. What time? 6 o'clock. So maybe you guys get the early bird special, but wait, there was a bus of adults that left on Friday. What time did you all gather to leave? 3. So you left at 3, they left at 6. I didn't leave till the next day. So maybe the adults get the prize as the early winners. Until I think about Sarah at Thornwell, who has been planning this work for churches like ours since she started this summer. So maybe she gets the early prize. Until I think about our MO&E team and Ladson and George, who, well, they've been planning this trip since last year. Maybe they get the prize. And until I think about George and Ladson and their involvement, they're not here today for me to verify this, but I'm assuming for decades with Thornwell. So maybe they get the prize for investment. So how do I feel about getting up early now yesterday to go for a day of work? I feel great. Because I may have been the last laborer to the field, but I got to serve. And I got to serve with folks who were passionate enough to have been involved for decades. As Jesus was telling this story, of course, he wasn't talking about Thornwell. He wasn't talking about a single day of service. He was talking about the kingdom of heaven. And those early laborers weren't the Kinslers. They weren't the Chrismans. They weren't the Dooleys. They were the Jews. When you talk about the heat of the day and born the work of the labor, try 40 years in the wilderness. Try generations under Pharaoh. They've been committed to kingdom work for a very, very long time. And so as we hear this parable, we have to hear it. If we're going to hear it right at all, we have to hear it as we're the last ones into the field. But I always like to twist parables a little bit, if for no other reason than for Richard Barker to come up to me after the service and say, "You are so weird." But why do we get wrapped up in the parable not being fair? Because we're so focused on the funding. What if this isn't a parable about money at all? Because as kingdom living, we know the parable really is about grace. And trust me, when it comes to the balance between do we want justice, do we want what's fair, or do we want what's loving and kind, I would much rather have God's love than God's justice. That's not to say justice is unimportant. We definitely don't want injustice. The early morning laborers were paid the fair wage. They were paid what they agreed to. We just got the same deal. I don't know how many of you have ever hired day laborers. I'm sure it happens around here, although I've not experienced nearly as much as I did up in Tennessee. There was a corner of the Home Depot parking lot where the guys just stood there for the day. You needed work done, you drive up, you pick and choose, you throw them in the truck, you take them home, you work. End of the day, you bring them back, you pay them, they're done. Some of those guys were there early morning, big strapping guys get picked first. Little scrawny guys get left for last. It's just the way it is in the world of hard labor. But those guys that were little and scrawny and left till last were still there all day looking for work. I want to suggest to you that in this parable, it's not that they showed up late. It's not that they were sleeping in. It's not that they were partying all night the night before. The text makes it clear. Why have you not been hired? Well, no one has given us the chance. So we can take away all the excuses of laziness or not involved or not engaged. They just simply hadn't been called. Justice or God's love? I understand the parable better when I understand that the denarius was a day's wage, and it's what provided food for your family the next day. We don't have food insecurity issues nearly at the same rate as Jesus' audience would have heard. But if you think about food insecurity issues, if you think about that denarius, if you think about how it's unfair, then I challenge you to think about the prayer we offer every week. It's called the Lord's Prayer. Jesus taught us how to pray it. Starts out, Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. What's next?
Thy kingdom come.
What? Whose kingdom? God's kingdom. Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. So it's about your kingdom, God. It's about your will. And then what's next? Give us this day. Whose daily bread? Our daily bread. Not my daily bread. Our daily bread. We're praying for that last-minute laborer to get a full day's wage. We're praying for God's love to be evident throughout God's kingdom because we believe that to be God's will. Why do we believe that? Because Jesus taught it to us. Here's the other piece of good news in the story. Because I don't think it's about the money. I think it's about the workers. And here's where you and I get to rejoice. The invitation to be part of the workforce continues all day long. You may have been first up. You may have been 9. You may have been noon. You may have been 3. You may have been 5. Or you may have been the last one called to the field. But brothers and sisters, we all have been called. Called to serve the Lord our Savior Jesus Christ. And called to serve with joy. In that calling, I want to swing it back around to money one more time. You notice I used offering plates with the kids because I wanted to draw your eyes to the offering. And I want you to ask yourself this question. When the offering plate comes by and you put in your tithes or offerings, are you doing that as a sense of duty? This is your justice. This is your legal obligation. This is your tithe. This is your 10%. This is your pledge to God. Or are you giving through the grace of generosity as a response to all that God has blessed us with? The reason I ask you that is, again, Jesus has taught us where your money is, your heart will follow. So as you think about your offering today, think about your own life. Are you living your Christian life as a sense of duty, as a sense of obligation, or are you living your Christian life in joy, as a generous response to the grace that God has blessed you with? The good news of the passage is this: God is still looking